Hello, welcome to an examination of Galatians. Galatians is probably the most often cited biblical text by Christians that want to argue that the Torah, anything Jewish with regard to worshiping Yeshua, is no longer valid, particularly chapter 3. What a lot of people don't realize is Galatians is probably the oldest of the Pauline letters. It may be a surprise to you to know that the order of books in the Bible is not by chronology, but it's by size. So while Galatians doesn't fit first, it was actually written first. And the first chapters of Galatians, or the first part of it, actually refers to history. Now, in order to read Galatians and the later letters by Paul, I think it's important to know that you also have to be familiar with Acts, because Acts also provides a chronology for what happened with all of the apostles, particularly with Paul. And so if you can follow in Acts, that will also help you get some greater understanding as to what is going on in Galatians. First, a little bit about Paul. Paul, also known as Shaul, and he actually had both names. Shaul was his Jewish name. Paul was his Roman name. And he had two names because Paul was the father of a Roman citizen. His father was a Pharisee, and Paul was raised to be a Pharisee. But because Paul's father was a Roman citizen, Paul became a Roman citizen and was entitled to all the benefits that Roman citizenship carried. So Paul was also raised to be a tent maker. Rabbis at that time had to have some other means of income, particularly if they were going to travel. So Paul was raised and taught how to make tents. And when he was 13, he was sent to Jerusalem to train as a rabbi. And he studied under Gamaliel, who was at that time one of the leading scholars of the Tanakh. So he studied under Gamaliel and became quite good and quite knowledgeable, and developed a reputation for being knowledgeable. There have been many books written on Paul's life, and I've read a number of them, and they all indicate that Paul grew up as quite committed to the Jewish faith. He was very good at his understanding of the Tanakh, but there are some scholars who theorize that Paul felt something was missing. Paul firmly believed that you attained righteousness by following all of the mitzvot, following the 613 commandments in the Bible, and that if you could follow those and lead that kind of life, that you would achieve righteousness. But he never felt complete. And it wasn't until he was actually there to witness the stoning of Stephen, who was the first martyr of the faith, that Paul felt a calling. And he felt that his calling was to persecute these blasphemous Jews who were preaching the coming of the Messiah, because Paul did not believe that the Messiah had come. He saw these people as a real threat to the Jewish faith, and felt that what he needed to do with his life was then to wipe these people off the face of the earth. And he became very good at doing that in Jerusalem. In fact, Paul was responsible for possibly hundreds of what you could call Christians, but they were actually Messianic Jews, members of the church called the Way. He was responsible for killing many of them. He sought and obtained permission from the council there, from the Pharisees, to go out and expand his persecution. And so it was on the way to Damascus where he actually saw the Messiah. The Messiah came to him, and he was struck blind. Now, many scholars, particularly Christian scholars, refer to this as Paul's conversion. But I don't believe that's accurate. Paul wasn't converted from Judaism to Christianity. A better way of looking at that is he became a full Jew. He became a Messianic Jew. He was no less Jewish after the vision, after being confronted with the Messiah, than he was before then. He simply realized that the prophecies had been fulfilled. So Paul was struck blind for 3 days. He was escorted on into Damascus, and around the time this happened, and angels of the Lord, and we learned this from Acts, angel of the Lord went to Cornelius. No, it wasn't Cornelius. It was Ananias, I think it was, and told him, they instructed him to seek out Paul and that he would be able to restore his sight. And in fact, that's what happens in Acts. And then after a while, Paul stays in Damascus for some time, does some preaching there, but then goes to Arabia for 3 years. He goes to Mount Sinai and spends 3 years in Arabia, I would imagine, thinking how he is going to deal with what he has learned, his change of thinking, because he's gone from being someone who is actively persecuting what we now refer to as Messianics, to now one who is preaching that message. He's preaching that gospel. So that was a life-altering thing for him, and I think it took him 3 years to decide what the message would be and how he was going to go forward with that. So Paul returns to Damascus, is actively preaching there, but they were members of the Jewish community who took exception to that. Members that were not on board with the belief that Yeshua was the Messiah and that the prophecies had been fulfilled. So at some point he had to be snuck out of Damascus, and we learn in Acts that it is around this time that Barnabas retrieves Paul, and they go and actually begin the first missionary journey, which is to Galatia. Now Galatia is a region in what today is central Turkey. But before going to Galatia, Paul went home. He went to Tarsus first and then to Galatia and established several churches in Galatia. And then he was provided with a vision that Jerusalem was going to encounter a famine. Paul was able to collect monies from the churches in Galatia and then return to Jerusalem. And it was while he was, after he had left Jerusalem and following the first council in Jerusalem where they signed off on him being able to preach the message to the Gentiles, with the only caveat being that he remembered the poor. It was after this that he then went on his second missionary journey. And while he was in Corinth, he received word from the Galatians that there was trouble there, and that what's known as the circumcision faction, which was groups of Jews who believed that in order to properly worship the Messiah, in order to accept that, you had to become Jewish. It's known as the circumcision faction in some texts. Well, those people had been actively engaged in trying to undermine what Paul had done. And their argument to the Galatians was that Paul was going off script, that Paul was not part of the original 12. There was a period of time where Paul and Peter got into sort of an argument, and in fact Paul rebuked Peter, and that's covered in Galatians as well as in Acts. And so they argued that what Paul was teaching wasn't sanctioned by Jerusalem. And they made a very strong argument that, yes, you can worship Yeshua the Messiah, but first you must convert. First you must go through that 3-year process of becoming a Jew, become circumcised, and follow all of the Torah, all of the commandments, honor all of the festivals, and be a Jew in order to be able to worship Yeshua. And Paul took exception to that, and that's very strong throughout the different chapters of Galatians. So, with that background in mind, I think we can start with chapter 1 of Galatians. And Paul writes an introduction, and he usually does this in all of his letters. He starts off with an introduction, and essentially he's reminding the Galatians who he was and giving them background and reminding them about how he set up the churches. He does this in other letters as well. And what's important to recognize is that at this time there were lots of traveling preachers. And a lot of those folks made money off of their preaching, and very often they would claim authority that they didn't have, and sometimes they would even send letters building them up as a follower of another preacher. So there were forgeries out there. There were letters that claimed to have been written by some people. In fact, they weren't. There were letters that claimed authority under the different apostles, and in fact they had no such authority, and it was kind of a racket back then. So it was very important for Paul to cite his authority, to remind people about things that only they would know, so that lent some authenticity to what he was saying. So Galatians chapter 1, from Shaul an emissary, I received my commission not from human beings or through human mediation, but through Yeshua the Messiah and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, also from the brothers with me. So what Paul is saying is that he gets his authority not from the Jerusalem Council. He doesn't get his authority, his ultimate authority, the original authority, doesn't come from them. It doesn't come from human beings. It comes from the Lord. To the Messianic communities in Galatia. And remember, Galatia was a region, and he's talking to all the Messianic communities there. And it's believed that it's in Galatians, and it's Paul who originates the term Messianic. Grace and shalom to you from God our Father and from the Lord Yeshua the Messiah, who gave himself for our sins, so that he might deliver us from the present evil world system in obedience to the will of God our Father. To him be the glory forever and ever, and amen. So that's his introduction. And so it's when you get to verse 6 that Paul really turns up the heat. Now I must give credit to some sources that I use. First off, I'm reading from the Complete Jewish Bible, which is translated by David Stern. And I also have relied heavily on Stern's commentary on the New Testament as well. In addition to books by Lancaster and some other books and some other writings. So as I can give credit to those, I do, but I'm telling you this, that I'm not making this all up, that I'm getting it from other sources. So verse 6 is where Paul really starts his message. And in some texts it says, you stupid Galatians, but in the Complete Jewish Bible it says, I am astounded that you are so quick to remove yourselves from me, the one who called you by the Messiah's grace, and turn to some other supposedly good news, which is not good news at all. And what he's referring to is what the circumcision faction had said with regard to how they were actually supposed to proceed, which was contrary to what Paul had been teaching. And it becomes much clearer further on. And I want to remind you that the Galatians are actually the members of the Messianic community in this region. But it's not just Jews that he's preaching to. A lot of these are Gentiles. A lot of these are God-fearers. A lot of these are indeed Jews that have been born Jewish and have been practicing the faith. But a lot of these Galatians were people who had been on the periphery. They were Gentiles who would attend Jewish services, who were not Jewish, but they would attend the synagogue. They believed in the one God. Some of these had been formerly idol worshippers. And indeed, some of these were Jews who had lost their faith, who had stopped being active in the Jewish community. They stopped practicing. So there was a wide range of people here. And also it's worth noting that the people he's talking to in Galatians are not the same people that he talks to in Corinthians or Ephesians or in Romans or those. Because each community was different, and some communities had problems that the Galatians didn't have, and vice versa. So, continuing on with verse 7, what is really happening is that certain people are pestering you and trying to pervert the genuine good news of the Messiah. And he's talking about the circumcision faction. But even if we, or for that matter, an angel from heaven, were to announce to you some so-called good news contrary to the good news we did announce to you, let him be under a curse forever. We said it before, and I say it again. If anyone announces good news contrary to what you received, let him be under a curse forever. So what Paul is talking about is the difference between the good news that he was preaching, which at its core was that the trusting faithfulness in Yeshua was enough, that it started with that. And then if you do the other things, and if you choose to follow the other commandments and you're leading a good life, that's secondary. But it must be preceded by trusting faithfulness in the Lord Yeshua. And so anyone that's preaching anything different than this is not preaching the good news. That is not the good news of the gospel. Verse 10, Now, does that sound as if I were trying to win human approval? No. I want God's approval, or that I'm trying to cater to people. If I were still doing that, I would not be a servant of the Messiah. Now, the reason Paul says this in verse 10 is that because the argument was made that he was trying to appeal to men, that he was trying to build up congregation sizes in order to claim credit for that, in order to boast for that. The claim was being made that he was preaching an easy gospel, that it was not difficult, it didn't require much in order to be a Jew or in order to be a follower of the Yeshua. And Paul is countering that, saying no, he's not trying to appeal to men. He's not trying to win over men just for the sake of being able to boast. He's doing this because it's what God wants. He's doing this for God. Verse 11, furthermore, let me make it clear to you, brothers, that the good news, as I proclaim it, is not a human product. Because neither did I receive it from someone else, nor was I taught it. It came through a direct revelation from Yeshua the Messiah. And he's talking about what happened to him on the road to Damascus. And again, I think it needs to be emphasized that this was not a conversion. And anybody who refers to this as a conversion is somehow saying he became a Christian. Well, that term doesn't apply anywhere in here. If you read the original Greek and the original Hebrew, he didn't become a Christian, he was still a Jew. And it's worth noting that if you believe that the prophecies of the Old Testament came true in the New Testament, with the New Covenant, then those people didn't stop becoming Jews, because if that was the case, then the prophecies in the Old Testament mean nothing. So these were Jews who believed that the prophecies of the Old Testament had come to pass, had come true. So they were still Jews. They were worshiping the Jewish Messiah. And what happened with Paul and with Peter's vision is that they realized that there were no difference between Gentiles and Jews as far as following the Messiah is concerned. Verse 13, for you have heard about my former way of life in traditional Judaism, how I did my best to persecute God's messianic community and destroy it, and how, since I was more of a zealot for the traditions handed down by my forefathers than most Jews my age, I advanced in traditional Judaism more rapidly than he did. So he's reminding them that for the longest time he had persecuted this church, and that he was following the old ways, and he was following the Tanakh. And because he was so knowledgeable, he had quite a reputation for being a zealot. Verse 15, but when God, who picked me out before I was born, and he's saying this was his calling, and called me by his grace, chose to reveal his Son to me so that I might announce him to the Gentiles, I did not consult anyone. And that's true, because when he preached this, when he established these churches in Galatia, he had not been back to Jerusalem. He had not been there to get approval from Peter and John. And I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were emissaries before me. Instead, I immediately went off to Arabia and afterwards returned to Damascus. And so that's what we've covered before, that he immediately went off to Arabia. He was there for 3 years, returned to Damascus, began preaching there, and had to be snuck out of the city. Not until 3 years later did I go up to Jerusalem to make Kepha's acquaintance, and I stayed with him for 2 weeks. Excuse me. But I did not see any of the other emissaries except Yaakov, the Lord's brother. So what he's reminding the churches in Galatia is that he didn't seek approval for this until after he had established these churches, and that Peter and Yaakov signed off on this. Concerning these matters I am writing you about, I declare before God that I am not lying. Next I went to Syria and Cilicia, but in Yehuda the Messianic congregations didn't even know what I looked like. They were only hearing the report. The one who used to persecute us now preaches the good news of the faith he was formerly out to destroy, and they praised God for me. So that's how chapter 1 of Galatians wraps up. It's an introduction. He's telling the Galatians, he's reminding them what his authority is. and he's setting the stage for what he gets into in chapter 2. Can you pause it?